Reading from AnnaVonReitz.com, The Final Lamb, or Stop Being Stupid, Part 21. The Bible is essentially an Egyptian retelling of Hebrew history, liberally edited numerous times by groups with access to grind. What remains is a very strange book indeed. Even the name of the Bible is peculiar. The words Holy Bible translate as Sun Book. Why? Because the Egyptians who created it worshipped a sun god, Amun-Ra, and their object in compiling the Bible was very different from what we assume. Didn't it ever strike you odd that the Hebrews out there roaming around in the desert managed to compile such a record as the Bible presents? Well, the fact is they didn't. The Egyptians and Ethiopians compiled and kept it for them from the time of Joseph to the burning of the great library at Alexandria and beyond. It's an Egyptian monotheist search for the true God that preserved the history of the Hebrews and later the history of the Israelites, and as a result, what comes down to us is seen through Egyptian-colored lenses. This is also why we have been taught to say Amen at the end of every prayer. That's like saying, Dear Father in heaven, blah, 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 Egyptian sun god. We assume that Amen means it shall be so, and that it's like a seal confirming the missive sent heavenward. But like so many other things, what we assume is undermined by other meanings of the same or similar sounding words. Now, it may seem ridiculous, and surely our Creator knows what we intend, so that no heartfelt communication is wasted. Yet imagine the irony of it, that virtually every prayer in Christendom is factually indistinguishable from the prayers of ancient Egyptian sun worshippers. The Egyptians and Ethiopians were by far the largest contributors to the preservation of the history of the Hebrews and Hebrew writings in general until the time of the Romans, when the Romans took over the task of preserving, editing, and passing along the bits that served their purposes. And the Romans were nothing if not pragmatic. The story of Jesus that they allowed to come forward is tailored to suit the Roman desire to preserve the Pax Romanus, the Roman peace, and to inculcate the values of good citizenship, that is, acquiescence to indentured servitude and slavery among the conquered races. The Jesus we have inherited is a watered-down and tamed version of the actual story, and central to his story are facts that we are never ever told. Jesus lived in Nazareth, all right, and so he's called a Nazarene. But more importantly, he was also a Nazarene. More of the usual similar word deceits have been used to cover up this fact. The Nazarenes were a populous sect inhabiting the Galilee area and standing as a buffer between the Samaritans to the north and the Temple Hebrews of the south. To put it mildly, Jesus came from the wrong side of the tracks despite his bloodline to King David. The Nazarenes as a group, to which John the Baptist also belonged, were famous for being polluted with Egyptian and Samaritan mysticism. This is part of why the Pharisees were so offended by the popularity of a Nazarene, and fearful of it too. The many miracles attributed to Jesus were derided as circus tricks among the educated Pharisees, who were themselves adherents to the great abomination Semiramis, and practitioners of idolatry and supporters of her money changers sitting in the temple courtyard. When Jesus drove the money changers from the temple and raised Lazarus from the dead, they knew they had to do something about him or lose their own shooting match. So they colluded with the Romans, who were not happy with the prospect of a political uprising of the natives to put an end to his ministry. Thus, the charge against Jesus was that he was, according to the Roman viewpoint, claiming to be King of the Jews and was a threat to Roman rule in the Levant. But the charge against Jesus from the standpoint of the Pharisees is never revealed. They condemned him as a Nazarene necromancer for raising Lazarus from the dead. The Nazarenes have throughout history been a secretive sect. After the death of John the Baptist and the crucifixion of Jesus and the raising of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 A.D., the larger portion of the Nazarenes came to settle in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, a vast swamp, where their descendants have lived ever since. Over the 20 intervening centuries, the blend of ancient Samaritan, Hebrew, and Egyptian mysticism they started out with has been blended with the mysticism of their Muslim neighbors, and the surviving Nazarenes have been hunted like animals through the swamps of the Fertile Crescent by successive waves of bounty hunters dispatched by the German and British and Russian and American governments. Why? To discover their secrets and pound them out of the survivors. Persistent rumors of angelic weapons in the area inhabited by the Nazarenes provided the impetus for this action. It was said that the remaining Nazarenes were the guardians of weapons that predated the flood of Noah, and that, like the Ark of the Covenant, these weapons were of divine origin and surpassing power. The biblical references to 4 angels being bound in the same area and being released in the latter days gave credence to the claims, and so far from the days of Hitler's search for the Orions, to now, the Nazarenes have been hunted and tortured and decimated for their knowledge of the most systematic and ferocious genocide of modern times. Russian efforts finally yielded pay dirt 2 years ago with the recovery of Gabriel's hammer. This weapon dates from the Great Plasma War, which occurred 32,000 years ago. Positioned in Antarctica, it was able to punch down or pull up large sections of the Earth's crust by as much as 400 vertical feet. Smaller models of the same technology can suspend or alter the laws of gravity, handy for dropping missiles and airplanes out of the air or sinking battleships to the bottom of the sea. Conventional warfare as it has existed on the planet is at an end, and the Russians hold the winning hand. They continue to scour Syria and loot Syrian, as in Sirius B, archaeological sites for the remaining 3 angels. If there are any Nazarenes left on earth, they are few and far between. From these sobering ruminations, we must rouse ourselves and ask, what of the Lamb of God? Was he not sacrificed once and for all the goats and sheep alike, for all the debts in all jurisdictions of the earth? Yes, that was the deal. All our sins, that is, all our debts, are forgiven before we can even commit them. The slate is wiped clean, and our debts and mistakes no longer stand between heaven and earth. Our Father no longer remembers our transgressions. So how is it that we're being plagued by Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, with accusations of indebtedness after they have claimed and seized hold of all the corporate governments on earth and absorbed all the riches of both land and sea? Why aren't our debts being paid for by these feckless trustees and paid in every jurisdiction? Why indeed? Jesus the Nazarene triumphed over Satan. The contest wasn't even close. Yet over time, Satan's followers embedded with the church have found their ways and means, and most of all their excuses for not paying up, especially on their home turf, the international jurisdiction of the sea. First, we were told that only confessing Christians could inherit the kingdom, and only Roman Catholics were confessing Christians, so that left everyone else out. But no, that was not the deal. Satan was allowed to do his worst, and he failed. He lost the bet. Both the goats and the sheep belong to Jesus, the Nazarene, and Satan has no claim against them. All people of all faiths existing in all jurisdictions have been bought and paid for and set free. All other pretensions are nothing but filthy, dirty lies. Second, we were told that we were bound by the doctrine of scarcity, that there just isn't enough to go around. And that's why people starve to death and die of thirst. The reason we must allow abortion to prevent overpopulation and the excuse for so many other evils. But that isn't true either. This planet was blessed with inexhaustible resources, far more than enough to provide all the actual needs and many of the vain wants of every man, woman, and child ever born. Any claim otherwise is simply another filthy, dirty lie and a blasphemy against our Father, who has loved us and provided for us and lifted us up as true sons and daughters. As beneficiaries of the divine trust, it is long past time for us to sit up and take notice and action. What possible excuse is there that all our debts are being paid? Every single one of them, literally. We are all exempt, and are all vessels in trade and commerce alike are prepaid and taxed per use, goats and sheep alike. We have no further need of redemption, For all have been redeemed for all time, and yet the reign of Satan has been allowed to continue on. His deceptions and deceits and false claims have been entertained, and the children of the true God have continued to be oppressed. The storehouses of God that Benedict XVI ordered to be opened have not been opened. No matter what else happens in the world of men or which country holds the weapons, it's time for the actual mission of redemption to be fulfilled and for the trustees to render the accounts. See this article and over 700 others on Anna's website at annavonreitz.com. Support her via PayPal. You spell the website ANNAVONREITZ.com. It's the Banks, or Stop Being Stupid, Part 22, by Anna von Reitz. The banks control the governments, not the other way around. It's been this way for 150 years in Britain, the Commonwealth countries, the U.S., Germany, most of Europe, most of Asia, most of Africa, and when a government tries to assert itself and make its own decisions and adopt its own currency for the benefit of its own people, as Libya's government did, and as Iran's government has, it is promptly attacked by all the other governments. Why? Because the banks run the governments as storefront governmental services corporations, and the banks like it that way. It gives them a free hand and world dominance. They get to use the resources of the entire planet any way they please. They get to regulate and deregulate themselves in whatever way is most advantageous to them. Forget the good of the people or the country they're supposed to be representing. Just look at what FDR did to the Virginia Colony Corporation when he shut it down and opened the United States Incorporated, and when he bankrupted the United States of America Incorporated. These were predatory corporate takeovers and mergers, and we all paid for them. Look at what the Federal Reserve banks did to the American states and people during the Depression. The suffering and losses that the American states and people endured were enjoyed as benefits and bargains by the perpetrators of the artificial boom of the 1920s, and the same self-interested men glutted even more profit from the bust of the Great Depression. Those responsible, including FDR, should have been tried as criminals, not lauded as heroes. The people were not sophisticated enough to recognize what the banks and their willing drones, the politicians, had foisted off on them. Then as now they slumbered on, secure in the comforting but false assumption that this was their government and their government wouldn't harm them. Let's not forget the sanctimonious role of the members of the bar associations colluding with the banks and their sub-rosa employees, the politicians, papering everything over and reassuring the public that it was all, quote, legal and proper. Perhaps that was the death knell of sanity in America, when the members of the bar started calling everything legal and not enough voices objected. It signaled that the American people no longer remembered the difference between lawful, the law of the land, and legal, the law of the sea. Another death knell came when people started being confused between the people of the United States and citizens of the United States, and millions in a zombie-like trance, beguiled and trusting what they believed to be their own dear government, agreed and said, yes, we are citizens. At each juncture, the perpetrators eased in and raped the sleeping body politic. The banks and their buddies have run rampant for a century and a half, and despite all the misery and expense of constant wars, despite the loss of millions of our sons and daughters, despite the malaise of our economy, the burgeoning welfare class, the press-ganging of our mothers and daughters to work as second-wage earners merely to scrape by, the merciless inflation of the only currency available for use, the increasingly reckless, arrogant, coercive, and abusive attitude of the quote-unquote government, we all managed to stagger along just barely, keeping in constant fear of the Internal Revenue Service on one hand and predatory lawsuits on the other. Here in the richest country on earth, supposedly living the good life, in the victorious bastion of freedom, we have been enslaved and swindled by our employees, bankers, and lawyers on a crime spree that would make Ramses of Egypt blush. Quadrillions of dollars worth of actual hard assets, gold and silver, jewels and artwork, artifacts and precious documents are on deposit with these same banks. These riches belong to people who are the beneficiaries of the historic trusts. These trust deposits are supposed to be managed by trustees who are appointed to their role or who inherit their position sometimes for many generations. Instead of honoring their obligation to the depositors, the banks are holding on to these assets of the historic trust and refusing to allow the lawful trustees to access these assets and use them as the donors stipulated. The banks are acting as self-interested robbers again, pure and simple. The oldest historic trusts were found in late antiquity at the time of the Roman collapse. Through the Dark Ages and well into the Renaissance, historic trusts were used to collect, protect, and transfer the wealth of men and organizations. By far the most common and among the richest historic trusts are those founded by Spanish conquistadors and by the Spanish monarchs through the early 1800s. These vast depositories of actual asset wealth were for the most part passed on by the original owners for the benefit of places and people, including their own families, hometowns, favorite places, charities, churches, and even their professions, and are today earmarked by the current trustees and beneficiaries for the benefit of all mankind. The bankers have blocked all efforts to secure the release of these vast stores of assets. They have pitilessly seen the photos of starving children in Africa and called them monkeys. They have swathed themselves in silk suits and fur and lived in the finest homes and considered themselves very wise and superior to the common man, who they have referred to as livestock. They have self-righteously donated dribs and drabs to charity and special causes, most of them calculated to benefit the banks and their pet projects, or used to promote their own government storefronts, or to pay off politicians, or to reward their faithful servants in the bar associations. They've made themselves out to be great philanthropists, using money they stole or coerced or gained by enslaving and making the lives of others miserable, and via the spilled blood of the innocent slaughtered in wars for profit. This is how we have the spectacle of the World Bank, IBRD, and others caught red-handed with gold and other assets confiscated from our grandparents and great-grandparents, pretending that this gold just appeared out of nowhere in their coffers, and also pretending that they don't know where it came from. We know where it came from. For starters, it came from my grandmother's wedding ring, twisted off her finger by foreign commercial mercenaries employed by FDR. Observe how the World Bank and IBRD tried to wash their guilty hands by offering to give our gold away to the rest of the world. And that's just $387 billion worth. That's chump change. The failure of the World Bank IBRD to return our confiscated gold to us is a teeny, almost trivial bit of the dishonesty that the bank's politicians and lawyers have nurtured into a festering epidemic. An epidemic of institutionalized corruption that is overwhelming and poisoning the whole planet. So now they've got themselves in a spot, and the propaganda machines just aren't working anymore. Let's cover some of the high points. The US dollar isn't worthless paper. It is, in fact, asset backed by oil, both crude and refined oil products. That's why it's called the petrodollar. So let's get that myth dismissed right now. The US dollar also isn't the American dollar. Let's get that nasty confusion cleared up too. Our dollar is a unit of exceedingly pure silver, always has been. And let's pop the gold bubble too. The sudden insist on gold mentality among Chinese investors is based on fear encouraged by self-interested sellers of gold and equally unprincipled Chinese hucksters hoping to make a fortune by running up the worldwide price of gold. The grandsons of the same men who set up the scam on Jekyll Island have moved their operations to China. Why? To spring a trap 14 decades in the making, but simple enough in the design. Collect, confiscate, impound, steal, import, control by hook or by crook all the gold in the world, and then force the grandsons and granddaughters of the people you stole the gold from to buy it back from you at wildly inflated prices. Lie and pretend that the world's gold reserves are much smaller and therefore more precious than they really are. Which brings me back to the issue of the historic trust and the quadrillions of dollars worth of hard assets cashiered away for hundreds of years, all being held captive by the banks that have no right of any kind to hold these assets against the will of the depositors, the rights of the trustees, and the welfare of the beneficiaries. There is right now in the Central Bank of Mexico a huge deposit of Spanish gold that belongs to the indigenous peoples, the sons of Spanish pioneers and the daughters of American cowboys, now living in the western United States. It has been placed on deposit there as a humanitarian bequest by the King of Spain, who intended that it be spent on infrastructure and educational programs, hospitals, and all the other things that people throughout this region needed in 1834. The gold was never delivered because other interests set up new untrustworthy government storefronts that were not committed to spending the money according to the king's wishes, so there it sits, more than 150 years later, gathering interest and value every year. It has grown into a very substantial trust able to support new infrastructure, new industries, new social services, new means of transportation, medical research, cultural preservation, and vast humanitarian relief to some of the poorest people of the poor in America. No more photos of Navajo elders squatting in front of a 5-gallon pail turned into a dangerous fuming charcoal stove trying to keep warm. The banks are too blocking the use of these and similar funds throughout the world because a few insanely greedy individuals refuse to come to an accommodation with the trustees of the historic trust. They aren't content to make 2 or 3 or even 10 times profit on the gold they've stolen, confiscated, and impounded. No, they want profits in the neighborhood of 100 times what they've invested. They think they will just sit on the historic trust and outright steal them, and nobody will have the resources to bring them to justice. They think they can discount the actual trustees and the beneficiaries and the law by handing off the management responsibility to a third party who they also propose to control and boss around. Why not? They literally employ, in your name of course, all the politicians you send to Washington and all the legislators sitting in the state legislatures throughout the country. All these people you think of as your representatives are literally bought and paid for corporate franchise employees of the banks running the governmental services corporations you have also mistaken to be your lawful government. Their only actual obligation is to make profit for the local state franchise. This is their job, and they can't do anything else because a commercial corporation is a psychopathic entity by definition. The fiduciary deputies of such an organization are allowed to worship only one God, profit, at any cost. That's the way commercial corporations operate, and unknown to you, that is what nearly all the county, state, and federal government operations have become, self-interested commercial corporations. That's also why banks are the horrible institutions they are. If their boards of directors spent 1 penny that wasn't aimed at making more profit for the shareholders and investors of the banks, they would not only lose their jobs, they'd be sued and hounded and disgraced. When you talk to the men in charge of the major banks and commercial corporations, they are compulsively fixated on making profit, and too many of them are willing to tear down and ruin the earth and kill the people on it, all in pursuit of profit for some numbers on a screen. If you're sickened by this, and you should be, you will now know for sure that banks, governments, and courts are all in desperate need of reform, and the entire concept of the commercial corporation must be revisited. Mankind is profoundly endangered by continuing to shelter psychopathic organizations in our midst. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the social, environmental, and human costs of commercial corporations run amok. Everyone reading this is the heir to a vast fortune. Yes, even the entire earth is yours and subject to your dominion. Vast stockpiles of gold and riches are set aside for you because one way or another, everyone on this planet is a beneficiary of one or another of the historic trusts. These are the storehouses of the Lord set aside for this time. In 2008, Pope Benedict XVI ordered them to be opened. As of 2017, here we still sit, waiting on Francis and the Curia and the Vatican Chancery Court. There was a final sacrifice in Canaan 2,000 years ago. A young man put aside his life for the sake of his friends and his love of the earth and all mankind. He paid it as the ransom for all people of all races and all religions forevermore. He paid it for the sheep and for the goats alike, even the profit-mad bankers. He paid the price of all our debts in all jurisdictions forever. And when I say all debts in all jurisdictions, I mean exactly that, all debts. Let that sink in. Not just for Christians, not just for Hebrews. This was done for all mankind everywhere, regardless of belief, regardless of faith. And then one more extraordinary thing. Having purchased us, he set us free and honored the law of heaven. He set us free from all debts for all time. But to fulfill what is written and to make all things correct, I have presented the payment bond and made it effective for 1,000 years, beginning January 6, 2017 through January 6, 3017. This is for the redemption of the kingdom of God and all those named as part of it. This axe fell on the Vatican Chancery Court on the day of the Three Kings, the traditional day when the kings of earth bring their gifts to the King of Heaven. So now the die is cast, and Pope Francis and his entire organization is held to account for allowing the imposition of debt where none exists, for failure to release the historic trust for the relief of mankind, for the creation of commercial corporations by the Roman Curia, and for allowing these diabolical inventions of the mind run rampant upon the earth. The indemnity bond posted for the people of earth is without limit. The first set-off bond is for $100 billion in silver, renewable as needed, and the payment bond AMRI 00003 is good for 1,000 years, after which we will have our final visitation and all will be fulfilled. I am sorry for all my own sins and apologize to those people I have offended by entitling this series of essays with the tagline, "Or Stop Being Stupid." I think that it is obvious that we and many generations before us have been stupid, dull, slow, gullible, complacent, unwary, and the list goes on. How else would we have been so deceived? I think it was also obvious that yes, we do have a choice in the matter. We could go on believing the lies and the fairy tales and go on being enslaved in the land of the free, or we can face the facts and jerk awake and ask the questions we need to ask, and foremost among them, how is this even possible? How have the people of the whole world been deceived, defrauded, and misled for thousands of years? It stands firmly on the record that we have been. People often say to me, "This has a ring of truth." There's a reason for that. It sounds true because it is true. Once you step back and really think about it, it's obvious. It's right in front of our faces. It is written on our history, revealed in our holy books, repeated in our laws, blazoned across the heavens, and resonating in our DNA. We know the truth. We just have to admit it to ourselves and then declare it and share it. Billions of people on this planet are suffering and going without the basics of life for no good reason. Other lives are rendered truncated and miserable, crippled by artificially manufactured scarcity, lacks deliberately created by banks, governments, and other commercial corporations via unlawful monopolization and manipulation of commodity markets and natural resources. This is being done to the heirs of creation, the children of the true God, the living people who are owed the benefits of the historic trust regardless of their race, religion, or nation. It's time that the banks are brought to an accommodation with respect to their activities interfering with the operation of our lawful government and withholding access to the benefit of our trust, both public and private, and the release of the hegemonies that they have established to control our lives, our labor, and our use of our own natural resources. It's time to examine the purpose of banks and other commercial corporations and to question any necessity for their continued existence in their present forms. We must remember that the Roman Curia created the entire concept of corporations. It is their responsibility to control them and to redefine them as necessary to ensure their proper functioning. When a dream turns into a nightmare and the pet becomes rabid, it's time for the owners to wake up and either find a cure or put the creature down. The banks and their government storefronts and other commercial corporations pillaging the people and raping the planet must be fundamentally and permanently reformed. The Curia is the international body responsible for doing this, and the Roman Pontiff is the official responsible for implementing it. I have waited 9 long years for the Curia to address the obvious and pungent problem. I have marked the days since the order was given by Benedict XVI to open the Lord's storehouses and provide relief for the people of this planet, and now I have presented the payment bond to the Vatican Chancery Court. In all these ways and for these reasons, Pope Francis and the Roman Curia and the Vatican Chancery Court stand at the epicenter of this essential conflict between the commercial corporations and the beneficiaries of the divine trust. As with any trust, the will of the donor and the good of the beneficiaries must be honored by the trustees. Otherwise, they must be recognized as false trustees and ousted for cause. In the 9 years since Benedict gave the order to open the Lord's storehouses, the people of this planet have continued to suffer in every corner. The historic trusts remain in lockdown imposed by the banks, which also refuse to release credit on interest owed. The Curia shimmy shuffles back and forth and takes no action to rein in, much less redefine the limits and objectives of the banks and other commercial corporations. The Vatican Chancery Court likewise hovers in interminable call waiting status long after the facts have been established and the issues ripened for decision. As of January 6th, the books have been balanced. They must stay balanced for 1,000 years, no matter what anyone else may do. See this article and over 700 others on Anna's website at annavonreitz.com. Give generously via PayPal. You spell it ANNAVONREITZ.com.